Welcome to this Lit in 5 video on chapters 4 to 6 inclusive on Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. This video is looking at conventions of crime, and this is perfect if you're studying this for paper 2 on the AQA syllabus, the Aspects of Crime module. Opening of chapter 4 here, very good for this idea of veneers, the illusion of sort of civility and very civilised existence here in King's Abbot and then particularly at Fernley. So we have Parker here. Good evening, Doctor. Coming to dine? Or is this a professional call? So we've got a reference here. Parker notices with an observant eye. That's an allusion to Shepherd's black bag, a Gladstone bag, I believe they were called, which doctors carry, which I had laid down on the oak chest. Now, the bag, of course, is a perfect way to smuggle things into the building and take things away from the building, like pairs of shoes or dictaphones. So we'll later see that revealed and unveiled by Poirot. Nice little sort of moment of irony here from Agatha Christie. Remember from the opening video, looking at the authorial level, a whodunit. Christie is in charge of what her narrator says, but also at the second level, the level of character and narrative, where Shepherd is trying to fool and deceive us and convince us that he's capable of writing a brilliant whodunit as well. However, looking at the level of Christie here, the lie Shepherd tells about the reason for carrying and bringing the bag. I explained that I expected a summons to a confinement case at any moment. Christie's given us clues, okay? So a summons, yes, you can be called to a particular medical case, but in a legal sense, a summons is where you're legally required to attend court for participation in a trial. On a similar note, a confinement case at any moment. Confinement, well, in addition, also hinting at criminality and punishment in terms of being imprisoned. Doesn't happen with Shepherd, of course, for reasons we know about, but embedded in the narrative, these seemingly throwaway references, which are actually important bits of foreshadowing, revelatory in terms of who our murderer is. What Christie again is setting up as again another form of misdirection and to mislead the reader. One of the early moments where Shepherd starts to be presented in the act of deduction, almost foreshadowing the idea that he's going to seemingly fulfil that Hastings role and become the new Hastings, the new assistant eventually to Poirot in the absence of Hastings, and assist the great Hercule Poirot in his detection. So if you look around here, they're trying to deduce and work something out. The windows were long French ones on the opening terrace. The sound I heard, therefore, could not have been that of a window being shut. Coals on the fire? No, that was not the noise at all. A drawer of a bureau pushed in? No, not that. So a little sort of early indication of the deduction skills, which we'll see more of later. From chapters 4 onwards, the murderer is yet to be committed, or is committed and not told at the end of chapter 4, and then chapter 5 is murder and the revelation of the murder. But already Shepherd is starting to shift suspicions, and the many characters in the closed circle whodunit just allows for massive sort of misdirection and multiple suspects, but we know the suspicions that James Shepherd is inviting the reader to have towards this character, that character, another character, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, is all misdirection. So this is starting here. Look, quite a lot of people do not like Flora Ackroyd, but nobody can help admiring her. And then there's kind of his admiration of her beauty. Okay, but this is sort of the start of it, I would suggest, structurally in the narrative. We'll show you more explicit examples of that in a moment. Now, look at this one at the level of sort of the authorial level I've spoken about. And to a jaded medical man, it's very refreshing to come across such perfect health. So he's got a bit of an attraction towards Flora Ackroyd. But Agatha Christie is giving you a clue here as part of the psychological profile of our murderer here. He is indeed, as we'll show you in other examples and previous and subsequent videos, he is jaded. The suggestion is that he's a bit miserable and a bit dissatisfied with his life in this small village where he's frequently regarded as not very intelligent. He's mocked and belittled, and that needles him, that annoys and irritates him. He's an extremely dissatisfied man, but it's very, very implied and suggested. Now that's definitely at the level of Agatha Christie, the authorial level, trying to give her reader clues as to sort of the motives and the psychological motives behind this man's dissatisfaction. So moments here hinting at the importance and the desire for wealth and being sort of comfortable financially, the sort of avaricious nature of so many of these characters. So we have an early indication of it here from Flora Ackroyd. I'm going to marry Ralph, you know, she went on. Uncle Roger Ackroyd is very pleased. It keeps me in the family, you see. And then there's the promise of doing up another house and give it to us. This is Flora and Ralph Patten. For us to live in. As we'll later learn, there's not sort of reciprocal or mutual affection in this sort of sham relationship between Ralph Patten and Flora Ackroyd. Ralph's heart lies with another, as you see later on, but there is this idea of sort of the depravity of people in this supposedly civilised society when it comes to the matter of getting their hands on money and wealth. So money, the root of all evil, as the proverb goes. This is absolutely something which rots away at these characters and their greedy nature. Speaking of this avaricious nature in supposedly civilised people, Mrs. Cecil Ackroyd. So in she rustles, it says here, clear disdain from Shepherd towards her. She is all chains and teeth and bones, a most unpleasant woman. Okay, so in she comes, she's all bones and skeletal, so you can imagine the sort of type from dramas you may have seen. Look at this kind of fake sincerity and this fake motherly concern, which is absolute nonsense. I can't tell you, my dear Dr. Shepherd, the relief to a mother's heart that her daughter is engaged and, you know, betrothed to Captain Ralph Patten. It isn't relief in terms of her daughter finding someone to love or being married. The feelings become absolutely clear. So he's just a little peculiar about money. Very usual, I've heard, amongst men who are captains of industry. I wonder, you know, if you, Dr. Shepherd, could just sound him, Roger, on the subject. So she wants to know about Roger's intentions in terms of whether she is in line to inherit money. So, and she'd happily have Dr. Shepherd exploit that friendship for her own gains, for her own kind of financial welfare. So, if we're ever talking about veneers and the supposedly respectable nature of these people, Mrs. Cecil Ackroyd in Chapter 4 is a great place to come to disprove that. As mentioned, there's a typical convention of a whodunit, to have multiple suspects, shifting suspicions throughout the narrative, sometimes even within the same chapter. Arguably too much at times, I guess, but it is the genre. Now suspicion turns to Hector Blunt. The aptonymic name of him to Hector is to pester and badger. and blunt is obviously being coarse, quite rude, unsophisticated. So the reputation of him: shot more wild animals in unlikely places than any man living, I suppose. Okay. Proficient with a gun, deadly with a gun, seems to show no real regard for life. It's obvious what's happening here. Suspicions are shifting, now focusing on this character. Behind it all is our first person intradiegetic narrator, who is trying to mask his own culpability in terms of this crime. So plenty more here in terms of suspicion. So we've got the killing of wild animals. He's strangely he's soft-footed for a man who's rather stockily built. So again, suspicion being averted towards Hector Blunt here. However, look at this. At the level of Christie, look at this. So he's shot at an animal, as was quite common at the time, to mount an animal's head. An immense animal's head with an amazing number of horns, which fixes you with a glazed stare as soon as you come inside the front door. Christie there, I think, is hinting at some kind of paranoia and guilt from James Shepherd. So yes, I guess a strange once living dead thing mounted on a wall would feel a bit unsettling, but we're going to show you a number of instances where James Shepherd, Christie is showing and hinting, giving you that clue, he doesn't like the scrutiny of another's eyes towards him. There are moments where that occurs with Poirot as well. So an interesting clue there. Okay, this page here I've just given you for kind of plot reasons, to be honest. So this quote here from Roger Ackroyd before he's killed. She, Mrs. Ferrars, confessed everything to having poisoned her husband. He was abusive, Ashley Ferrars, and an alcoholic. It seems that there is one person who has known of Mrs. Ferrars poisoning her husband all along, who has, James Shepherd, been blackmailing her for huge sums. It was the strain of that drove her nearly mad. Who was the man? So obviously he's not going to admit to it, but there he is, trying to, again, sort of deter and send suspicions elsewhere. Look at Shepherd's efforts here, or look at how Christie has Shepherd. Always a good way of wording these things. Shepherd trying to deter and convince Ackroyd away from pursuing who the identity of this blackmailer is. So the poor lady is dead. Why rake up past trouble? I rather agree with you, I said. Well, he would. So there's a call for justice here as well. How am I to get hold of that scoundrel who drove her to death as surely as he killed her? I like the idea of here he fastened onto it, the first crime, like some obscene vulture. So something parasitic there as well. You'll know there's a character in here called Mrs. Gannet as well. A gannet is like a vulture, something which picks away at flesh and feeds off the flesh of others. So I think Christie's got this idea of using sort of bird metaphors to convey the sort of avaricious nature of many of these characters, and how money is their Achilles heel. The pursuit of it is their motive for this kind of despicable behaviour. Certainly not respectable. She's paid the penalty. Is he to go scot-free? Well, in a way, yes. His suicide means he evades justice and proper legal punishment. Again, looking to deter Ackroyd as well. You want to hunt him down? It will mean a lot of publicity, you know. Trying to talk him out of it. So, well, you know, do you really want to do this? It'll mean terrible consequences for you. So we know his ulterior motive for doing this. Interesting piece of foreshadowing here as well. Presently, he, Roger Ackroyd, sank into the chair again. Well, he's about to sink into his chair for the final time very, very shortly. Okay, so a very key and important moment here in terms of the end of chapter 4. This is when the letter has arrived after her death from Mrs. Ferrars in the blue envelope, which is going to reveal or disclose a sort of mini or early form of a revelation in a whodunit of who the blackmailer was. Now, lots of irony here in the sense that the actual blackmailer's in the room, and at this moment, now when we know who the murderer is, it looks like Dr. Shepherd is going to be exposed as that obscene vulture who has been blackmailing Mrs. Ferrars. So on second reading, when we're aware that Shepherd is the killer, we can see much more now in terms of this bit of dialogue here. "No," I cried impulsively. "Read it now." Ackroyd stared at me in some surprise. So in retrospect, we can see that's the anxiety of a guilty man about to be exposed. But Christie, in terms of her control of plot, she defers that, okay? Now, you can feel that's a bit cheesy on retrospect, on second reading. Don't call it cheesy, call it a plot contrivance. So a moment in the plot which is deliberately there to kind of prolong the narrative and extend the sort of whodunit aspect of it, so we can have much more opportunities for multiple suspects, shifting between multiple suspects, those conventions of the genre that readers are expecting. We obviously don't want the reveal of the murderer in chapter 4. It wouldn't be a successful whodunit novel, would it? Look at this deceit towards the reader, though, okay? So we know why this happens here, but look at the thing that follows it. But for some reason, obscure to myself, I continued to urge him, Roger Ackroyd, to read who Mrs. Ferrars names as her blackmailer. Now, this is the deceitful bit. This is the lie, okay? It's not obscure to James Shepherd as to why he wants Ackroyd to read the name out. He wants to know if he's been named and labelled as the blackmailer. So early on, this is an absolute moment of deception from the intradiegetic narrator. We can only go from what they choose to tell us or not tell us. There's the effects of that style of narrative, that narrative perspective. So please look here. This is the moment the murder occurs. And as we've seen on the introductory videos, when we do spoil the ending, this is the moment where he doesn't tell us, or it's what is withheld from the reader. He actually gloats about this later when he's discovered giving himself a pat on the back in terms of, oh, what a great whodunit storyteller I am. So this is the bit here. I hesitated with my hand on the door handle, looking back and wondering if there was anything I had left undone. Now, that's as explicit as it's going to get. It's not very explicit. It's reticent and withholds details, the key detail of the murder. But he congratulates himself on this as a sort of ambiguous line later with those sort of writer aspirations he has. I could think of nothing. With a shake of the head, I passed out and closed the door behind me. And he gets a bit of a fright seeing Parker there as well. Now, two examples of misdirection here, given at the next chapter is chapter 5, and it's titled Murder. And that's when the reveal or the kind of public knowledge of Ackroyd being murdered comes to light. So, here's this sort of classist snobbery, because Shepherd has a clear dislike of Parker, but, or maybe because of, never mind, but, look at this kind of contempt here. What a fat, smug, oily-faced man Parker had, and surely there was something decidedly shifty in his eye. Don't forget, we are getting the narrative viewpoint of a doctor, a prestigious kind of pillar of the community is what we're expecting when we know our narrator is a doctor and who is soon to be the Hastings deputy to aid Poirot in the detection and the discovery of the murder. All of that is a brilliant play or subversion of that convention because we are looking at the murderer. All right. So when we have our doctor saying there's something decidedly shifty in Parker's eye, on your first reading, you're encouraged to believe that. A professional, honourable man took an oath to preserve life. Well, if the doctor thinks that Parker's decidedly suspicious, having Parker as my number one suspect right now. All brilliant adaptation of conventions to achieve misdirection. Conventionally, of course, there's a bit of a stereotype within this genre. What the butler saw, or the butler did it. So Christie's very, very clever with all of this. She knowingly uses that sort of cliché convention of a butler hating his master and killing someone of higher social class. So it is a cliche to suspect the butler, but she's using that cliche, and eventually you learn the layer above that, which is the fact that Dr. Shepherd is the murderer. Okay, so she takes that sort of cliched idea and she gives an extra layer of deception to it. Brilliant stuff. Speaking of misdirection, just after he's committed the murder of Roger Ackroyd, it's just so convenient that Dr. Shepherd bumps into a mystery stranger who is asking the way to Fernley Park. So this suits his narrative and his attempts to hide his own guilt perfectly. So again, this is almost cliched. Look, he was wearing a hat pulled down, collar turned up, couldn't see his face, seemed a young fellow, obviously pointing or trying to misdirect towards Captain Ralph Patten. That's Shepherd's main red herring, and it absolutely suits his attempts to hide his own guilt, that Ralph Patten is absent for most of the narrative. That suits him perfectly. Just so convenient too, the stranger actually announces that they're a stranger. I'm a stranger in these parts, you see. Okay, or however he speaks. Suitably, great timing to help with the misdirection. So look, multiple suspects. Parker, suspicion cast towards him. A mysterious stranger turning up to Fernley Park. Yep, we'll have a bit of that too. The odd thing was that his voice reminded me of someone's voice that I knew. Delightfully vague. Okay, but again, casting aspersions on someone within the closed circle of King's Abbot. But whose it was, I could not think. It doesn't matter, it's misdirection. But do keep an eye on this young fellow. That suits Shepherd perfectly with his very effective, for a large part of the novel, red herring of Ralph Patten. So here we have Shepherd presenting himself as this sort of heroic, dynamic hero, the concerned and, heroic doctor. So the door's locked. I wonder who locked it. We know. And then we get a bit of sort of bold heroism here, or what seems like bold heroism. Look here, Parker, I'm going to break this door in, or rather we are. I'll take the responsibility. If you say so, sir, said Parker rather doubtfully. I do say so. I'm seriously alarmed about Mr. Ackroyd. So look at that veneer or persona. He's portraying the dynamic sort of heroic doctor concerned for, the citizens and his patients, if you like, in this community. Just before this, of course, we've had the phone call, which Shepherd receives at home to announce the fact that there's been a murder. Obviously, this is staged. Parker didn't make that phone call at all. This was something Shepherd had performed, because obviously they can still trace phone calls and the origins and the source of those phone calls. Cutting edge tech in Agatha Christie's day. Interesting line here. Ackroyd was sitting as I had left him. Well, yes, quite. You were the last to see him, alive and dead, because you murdered him. But again, that's something you see on a second reading. So on your first reading, refer to that as a foreshadowing clue. At the level of narrative, read that as Shepherd, the would-be whodunit writer, gloating about his own sort of level of, well, I gave you clues, you didn't see it, did you? As I had left him when I killed him. In the armchair before the fire. And then there's the kind of sort of looks like it's the forensic eye of the doctor doing the sort of autopsy or the report from the crime scene as well. So his expertise is another kind of a persona here in terms of an illusion of hiding his own guilt. Two quick bits here just to suggest and avert suspicion towards Parker with sweating, could just be nerves, seeing his employer dead, seeing a dead body. So perhaps some perspiration is a bit natural, given what's going on. But Shepherd, the criminal, will obviously use that to direct suspicion towards Parker. There's more of that expertise here. Look, I did what little had to be done. Careful not to disturb, not to handle the dagger. So there's our professional doctor, who we suspect now is going to be an ally in the detection of the murder. But we know what we end up knowing. Another example here of the devoted professional, dedicated to truth and justice. Nothing must be moved. Leave it for the police. More suspicion cast towards Hector Blunt here. His face was expressionless as ever, an impassive sort of face, hard to read. But even this, Shepherd thinks he can see some emotion. Well, look, detected, all right? So again, that's kind of foreshadowing and setting up that Hastings role, an assistant to the detective. And obviously, mask gets you towards ideas of suspicion as well. Here's another character brought in to this kind of suspicion in the narrative. Geoffrey Raymond, hand was shaking. Robbery, I suppose, he said. How did the fellow get in? So we're getting sort of multiple motives as well as multiple suspects. So the plot is complicated, deliberately so. This is what writers of whodunits like Christie sets out to achieve. Is it robbery? Is it murder? Is it a mixture of both? Is it Geoffrey Raymond? Is it Parker? A good word to use here is proliferates. Okay, it widens out into many and myriad forms of suspects and many or myriad motives. It's deliberate. It deliberately becomes more complicated and complex until it eventually narrows down to the final reveal of the actual murderer. Christie sets up here what is going to seem in the narrative later on an important clue, all right? The blue envelope containing Mrs. Ferrars's letter had disappeared. Oh, I wonder how and who and what has caused the disappearance of that. We know, okay? So, again, this is sort of deceiving and tricking the reader. We're going to expect this clue to have to appear as a very important piece of the puzzle. It's never going to, okay, for reasons of self-interest and self-preservation. Just towards the end of this chapter, then, we can see Shepherd using, it suits him, it benefits him to bring up the mention of this suspicious stranger hanging around. So, again, just more misdirection and throwing suspicion here, there and everywhere to detract from any focus upon himself. Greater proliferation of suspects again. There's Shepherd being sort of very explicit in identifying Parker. Look, the most suspiciously flustered. The man was shaking and twitching all over. And then, of course, there's the importance of seeing Miss Ackroyd, Parker, Miss Ackroyd, Hector Blunt, Geoffrey Raymond. You don't have to count them, but there's four. It's impossible to separate them. It proliferates, and eventually it kind of comes back in and narrows as to who the suspects are. More ideas of the helpful and devoted doctor, the trustworthy professional man, as an aid to the law here. To make things clear and explain the position, I have appended a rough sketch of the right-hand wing of the house. So to the reader in this crime novel he's writing, there you go. I'm bringing you along with the ability to detect good, helpful, law-abiding citizen. No. Nice small moment of humour here in terms of how inept and incompetent your normal or typical inspectors are. We're needing Poirot here because we're going to struggle to find the murderer with this level of skill. The fellow had his coat collar pulled well pulled up, and his hat squashed down over his eyes. Said the inspector, Inspector Davis. Looks as though he wanted to conceal his face. Really? We need Poirot, okay? When the topic of blackmail occurs, look at the reaction Christie wants you to notice in relation to our narrator. Blackmail? Very much startled. And then I guess because of that fear or discomfort he has, look at how he steers focus towards Parker. Well, if Parker heard anything about blackmail, I said slowly, he must have been listening outside this door with his ear glued against the keyhole. So very, very happy to direct suspicions towards the butler. Interesting change here, though, in terms of Dr. Shepherd. So in this moment now I'm looking at on screen, then he's happy to continue directing suspicion towards Parker. But then you might wonder why he goes and complicates it here and puts more problems or questions in the way of the pursuit of Parker. I think that's still deliberate. I think he wants to make things harder for the police to prolong or extend or make it more difficult to try and label a suspect. So he set up the idea of Parker being the suspect, but then to make it even more difficult, to present them with more problems, really, and therefore make it even less likely Shepherd himself will be the focus of this investigation. He then puts these problems. There's only one thing against Parker being the suspect, and then he talks about that and the telephone call. So further problems, okay, but all done to complicate and sort of multiply, if you like, the misdirection. More examples here in the quotes being highlighted. You can read through yourself and look for close detail. More ideas of the professional, the devoted doctor wanting to aid and assist the course of justice. But within that, we have these examples of misdirection. Look, he may have died without knowing who his assailant was. Couldn't be further from the truth, could it? And then Inspector Davis, who's absolutely a recruit to Shepherd's idea of suspicion. Inspector Davis isn't very bright. Butlers can creep about as soft-footed as cats. There's not going to be much mystery about this crime, because he's very simplistic and not very competent, is the idea here. Just to contradict this is a beautiful sort of metaphor in the description of the murder weapon over here. So, I know this comes first and that follows, but this apparent simplicity of how easy it's going to be to solve the case and things like fingerprints, no. The actual solving of this is going to be like this description of the dagger here. So a beautiful metaphor, really. The discovery of the murderer, or the plot and the reveal of it, is going to be a narrow tapering blade and hilt of elaborately intertwined metals of curious and careful workmanship. So I'll attempt a drawing of that on the screen in a moment, but elaborate intertwined, that's plot and plot lines and clues. That's essentially a brilliant metaphor for Christie's brilliant whodunit. Tapering, narrowing to a point at the end, as all kind of daggers and blades and swords do, is to the final reveal of Shepherd as the murderer. But this entire novel, at the level of Christie being in charge of it, but also Shepherd as the writer of this manuscript, as he calls it, it absolutely is a case of curious and careful workmanship. So I thought that was a brilliant description of a dagger, but very clever in terms of sort of almost a metafictional metaphor about the workings of a whodunit itself. Last thing on this page, remember earlier we spoke about a quote-unquote jaded medical man. Christie, I think, presents Shepherd occasionally as a very sort of snobbish and snooty man who believes himself to be above most, maybe if not all, of the inhabitants of King's Abbot, beg your pardon. So we've got our very unintelligent Inspector Davis here. Fingerprints. Yes, Yes, I guessed that. So he doesn't like being spoken to as, unintelligent. His sister does that frequently, and this very unintelligent inspector does it here again. Now, here's an interesting moment in terms of the psyche of the criminal. I do not see why I should be supposed to be totally devoid of intelligence. After all, I read detective stories and the newspapers, and I'm a man of quite average ability. I think he's using understatement there. I think he considers himself to be more than average ability. To be fair, he's a doctor. He's an educated professional man. But the point I want you to see is how there's an ego within this criminal. And being spoken to or viewed as less than intelligent is sort of like an Achilles heel. It's a raw nerve. You can then extrapolate from that in sort of a detective sort of way ourselves. This is a key motivation behind the criminal actions of Dr. Shepherd. He considers himself above these people. His life, he sort of wanted to be more than just a small town village doctor. So when the inhabitants of it treat him as, less than intelligent, this breeds resentment in the man. That and problems with money. So the money he blackmailed from Mrs. Ferrars, we see from chapter 3, the man who grew vegetable marrows. Shepherd, it's suggested, has wasted that money. So here he is, stuck in King's Abbot, with less money than he would like, and a festering resentment of the people who he shares his life with. Okay, I'll show you some more examples of that when it occurs. But you could also look at living with his sister, who is very dismissive of him. Shepherd isn't married, he lives with this sister, and part of the motivations for his crime as well is to hoodwink or deceive his know-it-all sister. So there's some key motivations in terms of the psyche or the mind of our criminal here. More to follow. The well-travelled military man, Major Blunt here, showing his knowledge and his insight about the dagger. This obviously helps to direct suspicion his way in this moment. Very knowledgeable about the murder weapon, I see, Major Blunt. So more misdirection that way. Aid Shepherd. Same here with Geoffrey Raymond. Multiple suspects. I'll leave you to read that. Never seen him ruffled or out of temper. So too much in control of his emotions, suspiciously so. Adding further to Blunt's suspicions, or suspicion towards Blunt here, said the inspector suspiciously. Wrong moment, said Blunt. Lot of harm done by blurting out things at the wrong time. Indeed, in terms of our narrator. So if we're looking at Blunt in terms of reticence and withholding information, then we have someone who's far superior to Blunt than that, Dr. James Shepherd. Quite a simple page, really, in terms of adding further suspicion to multiple characters. I won't dwell on that too much coming forward. I'll just leave them in yellow, but they're there for you to see. Why is Geoffrey Raymond chuckling? He regularly does. Is that inappropriate? What's that suggesting if he's sort of showing signs of mirth and humour during a murder investigation? Could be a nervous laugh, but it helps direct suspicion towards him. Similarly with Miss Russell, rather a tartar, I should fancy. She's very abrupt and short with people she talks to. There's another suspect or another direction in which suspicion can go. So she's the housekeeper. It's a good point to consider here how Shepherd is very happy to direct the reader's attentions towards the service class within the novel. So you could see that as a sort of classist snobbery from Shepherd, which I don't think is incorrect about the man's mindset. Useful quote here at the end of this chapter to support the idea of a jaded medical man. Youth, Geoffrey Raymond, is very buoyant. Even the brutal murder of his friend and employer could not dim Geoffrey Raymond's spirits for long. Perhaps that is as it should be, I don't know. I have lost the quality of resilience long since myself. So there's some kind of misery. I guess we'd say depression. As well, I'm not young anymore. Here I am, stuck in King's Abbot, jaded medical man. I think there's envy at times towards Geoffrey Raymond, who's young, has his whole life ahead of him. So when Shepherd looks at Geoffrey Raymond, there's a keen, sort of stinging reminder that he is no longer a young man and has had to settle, and here he is trapped in this dead-end village. Back home to his sister here, obviously Shepherd has to be very careful what he does and does not disclose in front of his sort of nosy, busybody, gossiping sister Caroline, and obviously an example of reticence here. I said nothing of the blackmailing business, obviously and understandably a sore point, but contented myself with giving her the facts of the murder. So Shepherd quite smug here and in control of what he does and doesn't tell Caroline. So there's a sense of sort of a smug arrogance here, which obviously is not wise, particularly when Hercule Poirot becomes the chief investigator. Okay, chapters 4 to 6 done.